London, 1817. The invitation had arrived 3 days prior, delivered by a footman whose livery bore the crest of the Marchioness of Ashford. Vivian Langford had held the cream-coloured card in her trembling fingers, reading and rereading the elegant script that summoned her to the most exclusive event of the London season. Her aunt, Lady Margaret Fairfax, had secured the invitation through channels Vivian dared not question, and now, as her modest carriage approached the illuminated mansion on Grosvenor Square, she understood the magnitude of what lay before her. The year was 1817, and London society operated under rules as rigid as iron and as unforgiving as winter frost. Vivian was the daughter of a gentleman whose fortune had evaporated in a series of unfortunate investments, leaving her with nothing but a respected name and the education befitting a lady. Her mother had passed when she was merely 12, and her father had followed 6 years later, his heart broken by failure and debt. At 23, Vivian lived on the charity of distant relatives, her position in society precarious at best, her future uncertain at worst. The memories of her childhood were bittersweet treasures she kept locked away in the deepest chambers of her heart. She remembered her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair before bedtime, her father's booming laugh echoing through the halls of Langford Manor, the smell of roses from the garden where she had played as a child. Those days seemed to belong to another lifetime, another girl who had believed the world was kind and fortune was permanent. That girl had died slowly year by year. As creditors came calling and the walls of her world closed in around her, her father had tried to shield her from the worst of it. Even as his health failed and his spirit broke under the weight of insurmountable debt, he had maintained the fiction that everything would be well, that some miracle would save them. But Vivian had been old enough to read the truth in the worried glances of servants, in the gradual disappearance of paintings and silver from the manor, in the way her father's shoulders bowed under invisible burdens. She had watched him age a decade in a single year, had seen the light fade from his eyes, and when he finally succumbed to a fever that a stronger man might have survived, she had not been surprised. He had been defeated long before death claimed him. Yet tonight, she had chosen to walk into the lion's den. The Marchioness of Ashford's annual ball was where fortunes were made and reputations destroyed, where marriages were arranged and alliances forged. It was also where Seraphina Aldwych reigned supreme, the acknowledged beauty of the season, whose father's wealth from textile mills in Manchester had purchased her entry into circles that would have otherwise remained forever closed. Vivian descended from the carriage, her gown of pale blue silk catching the light from 100 windows. The dress was 3 seasons old, carefully altered and refreshed with new ribbons, but it fit her slender frame perfectly, emphasizing her graceful neck and the gentle slope of her shoulders. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style, adorned with her mother's pearl combs, the only jewelry of value she still possessed. She wore no other adornments, and in their absence there was a purity, an honesty that set her apart from the heavily jeweled ladies who swept past her into the mansion. She had spent hours preparing for this evening, not just in the physical sense, but in the mental fortification required to face what she knew awaited her. She had stood before her mirror and practiced her expression, ensuring that no trace of fear or uncertainty would show on her face. She had rehearsed conversations in her mind, prepared responses to the cutting remarks she anticipated, and reminded herself again and again that she had every right to be here, that poverty did not diminish her value as a person, that she was still Vivian Langford, daughter of respected parents, educated and accomplished in her own right. The entrance hall took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across marble floors, and the walls were adorned with priceless paintings and gilt-framed mirrors that reflected the splendor back upon itself. A curved staircase rose to the ballroom above, and from that height came the sounds of an orchestra playing a waltz, punctuated by laughter and conversation. Vivian handed her modest cloak to a footman and began her ascent, aware of eyes upon her, aware that she was being measured and found wanting even before she reached the top of the stairs. Each step felt like a small victory and a potential disaster. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her from all sides. The other guests, resplendent in their finery, seemed to radiate an effortless confidence that came from never having questioned their place in the world. They wore their wealth and privilege like a second skin, comfortable and unthinking. While Vivian felt every thread of her carefully maintained gown, every strategic placement of ribbon meant to disguise its age. The ballroom was a sea of silk and satin, of diamonds and pearls, of faces both familiar and foreign. Vivienne paused at the entrance, searching for her aunt among the crowd, but Lady Margaret was nowhere to be seen. She had promised to arrive early and meet Vivienne near the refreshment tables, but the appointed spot stood empty, save for a cluster of young gentlemen engaged in animated discussion. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. To be alone in this place, without ally or advocate, suddenly seemed like madness. What had she been thinking, accepting this invitation? She should have known better, should have recognized that this world was not meant for people like her, people who had fallen from grace and could never truly climb back. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, another voice spoke up, stronger and more defiant. This voice reminded her of her mother's courage in the face of illness, of her father's dignity even in defeat, of the long line of Langfords who had faced hardship and survived. She was not nothing. She was not no one, and she would not be driven away by fear before she had even truly arrived. It was then that Vivienne felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched with particular intensity. She turned, her eyes scanning the assembly, and found herself meeting a gaze that seemed to pierce through pretense and propriety alike. The man stood near one of the tall windows, his posture relaxed yet commanding, his evening clothes cut with such precision they could only have come from the finest tailors on Savile Row. He was tall, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair that swept back from a face marked by intelligence and something else, something that spoke of depths Vivienne could only guess at. There was something in his expression that arrested her attention completely. He was not looking at her with the idle curiosity of someone observing a novelty, nor with the pitying condescension she had grown accustomed to from those who knew her circumstances. Instead, his gaze held an intensity that suggested genuine interest, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle or understand a mystery that intrigued him. She did not know then that she was looking at Duke Albert Thornbridge, the most eligible bachelor in England, a man whose title dated back to the Norman conquest and whose wealth was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. She knew only that his eyes held hers for a moment longer than propriety allowed, and in that moment something shifted in the air between them, something neither could name, but both could feel. The Duke, for his part, had attended the Marchioness's ball out of obligation rather than desire. He had grown weary of the endless parade of debutantes and their ambitious mothers, of conversations that never went deeper than the weather and the latest gossip, of women who looked at him and saw only a title and a fortune. He had begun to wonder if he would ever meet someone who might challenge him, interest him, see him as something more than a prize to be won. And then she had entered the ballroom, this young woman in a gown that was clearly not new, but worn with such grace it might have been the latest fashion. There was something in the way she held herself, a combination of pride and vulnerability that caught his attention immediately. She stood alone, searching the crowd with barely concealed apprehension, and yet she did not cower or retreat. There was steel beneath her silk, strength beneath her seeming fragility, and he found himself inexplicably drawn to her. The spell broke when a voice, clear and carrying, cut through the pleasant hum of conversation. Vivienne turned to see Seraphina Aldwych, standing not 10 feet away, surrounded by a coterie of admirers, her beauty undeniable in a gown of emerald silk that must have cost more than Vivienne's entire wardrobe. Seraphina's golden hair was arranged in elaborate curls, and diamonds sparkled at her throat and wrists, catching and throwing back the candlelight with almost painful brilliance. Seraphina's blue eyes, cold as winter ice, fixed on Vivienne with an expression of disdain so profound it seemed to freeze the very air. The women in Seraphina's circle followed her gaze, and one by one the conversations around them began to fade as more people took notice of the confrontation brewing. "How curious," Seraphina said, her voice pitched to carry across the sudden quiet. "I was not aware the Marchioness had begun inviting charitable cases to her entertainments. Tell me, Miss Langford, did you arrive in a proper carriage, or did they send the coal wagon for you?" Laughter rippled through the group, cruel and sharp. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face, but she did not lower her eyes. She had known this might happen, had steeled herself for exactly this moment, yet the reality of public humiliation was far worse than any imagining could prepare her for. The words struck her like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. Serafina had a gift for cruelty, a talent for identifying exactly where someone was most vulnerable and striking there without mercy. And Vivian was vulnerable indeed, standing in borrowed elegance among people who would spend more on a single evening's entertainment than she had to live on for a year. "My transportation is my own concern, Miss Aldwych," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "as is my invitation, which was extended by Lady Ashford herself." "Oh, an invitation secured through pity and family obligation, no doubt," Serafina continued, warming to her theme as she saw she had an audience. "Really, Vivienne, you must see how pathetic this is. You do not belong in this hall. You do not belong among us. Your father died in debt, your family name is tarnished, and you live on charity. What possible reason could you have for subjecting yourself to this display? Do you hope to catch a husband? Do you imagine some gentleman here will overlook your poverty and your circumstances out of misguided chivalry?" The words struck like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to destroy. Around them the crowd had grown, drawn by the spectacle like moths to flame. Vivian could see the faces, some sympathetic, some merely curious, others openly enjoying her discomfort. This was entertainment for them, a drama played out for their amusement, and she was the unfortunate player cast in the role of victim. But Vivian Langford had not survived the loss of both parents, the dissolution of her family's fortune, and years of living on sufferance only to be broken by the spite of a girl who believed money could purchase class. She drew herself up to her full height, her chin lifting, her eyes meeting Serafina's without flinching. "You speak of belonging, Miss Aldwych, as though it were determined by the weight of jewels around one's neck or the price of one's gown. But belonging, true belonging, comes from within. It comes from knowing who you are, from carrying yourself with dignity and grace regardless of circumstance. My father may have died in debt, but he died with honor. He never compromised his principles or his character for money, and neither shall I." She paused, allowing her words to settle over the assembled crowd, and then continued, her voice growing stronger. "You ask why I am here? I am here because I was invited. I am here because I have as much right to enjoy an evening of music and society as anyone in this room, and I am here because I refuse to hide in shame for misfortunes that were not of my making. If that makes me pathetic in your eyes, then so be it. But I know my worth, Miss Aldwych, and I need no validation from you or anyone else to affirm it." The silence that followed was profound. Serafina's face had gone from smug satisfaction to barely concealed rage, her carefully cultivated composure cracking at the edges. She had expected Vivian to crumble, to retreat in tears, to provide the kind of spectacle that would be whispered about for weeks to come. Instead, she had been challenged, her own character called into question by the very person she had sought to humiliate. "How dare you?" Serafina hissed, taking a step forward. "You insignificant, presumptuous little nobody. I will see you driven from this house, from every respectable house in London. By the time I am finished with you, you will regret the day you dared to speak to me in such a manner." "That will be quite enough, Miss Aldwych." The voice was deep, authoritative, and utterly commanding. Every head in the room turned toward its source, and Vivian found herself once again meeting the eyes of the tall, dark-haired gentleman who had watched her from across the room. He was moving toward them now, the crowd parting before him as water parts before the prow of a ship, and in the faces of those around her, Vivian saw respect, fear, and something approaching awe. "Your Grace," Serafina breathed, her anger transforming instantly into simpering delight. "How kind of you to join our little gathering. I was just explaining to Miss Langford that she has made a dreadful mistake in presuming to attend an event of this caliber." The Duke stopped directly between Vivian and Serafina, his tall frame creating a physical barrier. When he turned to look at Serafina, his expression was one of polite ice, the kind of controlled disdain that spoke of breeding and power in equal measure. "I heard every word of your explanation, Miss Aldwych, and I find it both unnecessary and unkind. Miss Langford is a guest in this house, invited by our hostess, and as such she deserves the courtesy and respect we would extend to any lady of quality." "But your grace," Seraphina protested, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, "surely you must see that there are standards to be maintained. One cannot simply allow anyone into society simply because they possess a respectable name. There must be means, there must be position, there must be character," the Duke interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "There must be dignity. There must be the kind of courage that allows a person to stand firm in the face of cruelty and maintain their composure when others seek to tear them down. These are the qualities that define a true lady, Miss Aldwych, and I have observed them in abundance this evening." He turned then, his full attention focusing on Vivian for the first time since he had intervened. Up close, he was even more imposing, his height forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. But those eyes, dark and intelligent, held no threat. Instead, she saw in them something that made her breath catch in her throat: admiration, respect, and a spark of something deeper, something that promised complications she could not yet fathom. "Miss Langford," he said, his voice gentler now but no less powerful, "I am Albert Thornbridge, Duke of Ravensworth. I wonder if you would do me the honor of joining me for the next waltz. I find myself in need of a partner who understands that true nobility has little to do with titles and everything to do with character." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, not to Vivian, but to everyone watching. To dance with the Duke was to be publicly acknowledged, to be given his stamp of approval. And once given, such approval could open doors that would otherwise remain forever closed. Vivian understood this instinctively, just as she understood that accepting would make her an enemy of Seraphina Aldwych for life. She also understood that refusing would be an insult the Duke might never forgive, and more than that, it would be a rejection of everything she had just claimed to stand for. She had declared her worth, had insisted on her right to be treated with dignity and respect. To refuse his invitation now would be to suggest that she doubted her own words, that she believed Seraphina's cruel assessment after all. "The honor would be mine, Your Grace," Vivian replied, placing her hand in his outstretched palm. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and he led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz. Around them the crowd whispered and speculated, but Vivian was aware only of the Duke's hand at her waist, of the way he guided her through the steps with practiced ease, of the fact that for this moment she was the center of attention for all the right reasons. "You handled yourself admirably," the Duke said as they moved across the polished floor. "Miss Aldwych has made a habit of using her father's wealth as a weapon against those she perceives as threats. I confess I have grown weary of her particular brand of cruelty. I am grateful for your intervention, Your Grace, though I fear I may have made a powerful enemy this evening." "You made an enemy the moment you walked into this room," the Duke replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Miss Aldwych does not tolerate competition, and you, Miss Langford, whether you realize it or not, are formidable competition indeed." Vivian looked up at him in surprise. "I competition? Your Grace, I have no fortune, no prospects, no—" "You have grace," he interrupted gently. "You have dignity. You have the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving hardship without allowing it to embitter you. You have honesty in a world that trades in lies and pretense. And you have beauty, Miss Langford, the kind that comes from within and radiates outward rather than being merely painted on the surface." She felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words, unused to such direct praise, especially from a man of his stature. "You are very kind, Your Grace. I am very honest, Miss Langford. There is a difference." He guided her through a turn, his movements so smooth she felt as though she were floating. "Tell me, what brings you to London? Surely you have not come merely to attend balls and face down spiteful debutantes." "I came because I had nowhere else to go," Vivian admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "My father's estate was sold to pay his debts, and I have been living with various relatives who took me in out of duty rather than love. My aunt, Lady Margaret Fairfax, offered me a season in London, though I suspect it was more to fulfill a promise she made to my mother than any real desire for my company." "And what do you hope to gain from this season?" the Duke asked, his eyes never leaving her face. "Honestly, I hope to find employment as a governess or companion. I am educated, I speak French and Italian, I play the pianoforte reasonably well, and I have been told I have a way with children. If I can make the right connections, secure the right references, perhaps I can establish myself in a respectable household and earn my own living." The Duke's expression grew thoughtful. "That is your ambition? To become a governess?" "It is a practical ambition, Your Grace. I have no fortune to recommend me to potential suitors, and I have no desire to marry for convenience or security alone. I would rather earn my own way in the world than become a burden or sell myself to the highest bidder." "What if there were other options? What if a man were to court you not for fortune, but for yourself?" Vivian laughed, a soft, sad sound. "Then he would be a fool, Your Grace, and I would question his judgment. Men of quality marry women of quality, and quality, in our world, is measured in pounds and property. I am too much of a realist to imagine otherwise." "Perhaps you underestimate yourself, Miss Langford, and perhaps you underestimate the men of quality you speak of." The waltz was ending, drawing to its graceful conclusion. The Duke guided her through the final steps, and then, as the music faded, he brought her hand to his lips, placing a kiss just above her glove in a gesture that was both courtly and curiously intimate. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Langford. I hope we shall have opportunity to speak again before the evening ends." "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace," Vivienne replied, curtsying deeply as propriety demanded. As she rose, she caught sight of Serafina across the room, the woman's face a mask of barely controlled fury. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Vivienne understood that something had changed irrevocably. She had been marked, first as an enemy and now as something more dangerous, a rival. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. The Duke's public approval had transformed Vivienne from an object of ridicule into a person of interest, and suddenly she found herself surrounded by people who had ignored her entrance but now competed for her attention. Gentlemen solicited her for dances, ladies engaged her in conversation, and through it all she remained acutely aware of the Duke's presence, of the way his eyes found her across crowded rooms, of the subtle nods and small smiles they exchanged. She also remained aware of Serafina, who watched her with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. Vivienne had no illusions about what would follow this night. Serafina would not forgive or forget the public humiliation of being corrected by the Duke, nor would she accept Vivienne's unexpected rise in social standing without mounting a counter-offensive. When the evening finally drew to a close, and Vivienne found herself once more in her modest carriage, she allowed herself to lean back against the worn cushions and close her eyes. The night had been unlike anything she could have imagined, filled with moments of terror and triumph, humiliation and vindication. She had entered the Marchioness of Ashford's ballroom as an insignificant nobody, and she had left it having danced with the most eligible bachelor in England. But as the carriage rattled through the dark London streets, Vivienne could not shake the feeling that she had set something in motion, something that could not be easily stopped or controlled. The Duke's attention had been flattering, his defense of her gallant, but she was wise enough to know that in the world of high society, today's champion could be tomorrow's forgotten memory. She had no fortune, no family support, and now she had made a powerful enemy in Serafina Aldwych. The sensible thing would be to withdraw, to abandon any hope of further social engagements and focus on her original goal of securing a position as governess. The sensible thing would be to forget the way the Duke had looked at her, the things he had said, the possibility that had flickered briefly to life in her heart before cold reality extinguished it. But Vivienne Langford had not felt truly alive in years, not since before her father's death, not since before the slow, grinding poverty that had worn away at her spirit day by day. Tonight, for a few brief hours, she had remembered what it felt like to be herself, proud, dignified, and unashamed. And now that she had tasted that feeling again, she found herself reluctant to let it go. The carriage stopped before the modest townhouse where she lodged with her aunt, and Vivienne descended into the cool night air. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the dramas of mortal hearts. She stood for a moment, looking up at them, and made a decision. She would not hide. She would not retreat. Whatever came next, whether triumph or disaster, she would face it, as she had faced Serafina Aldwych. with her head held high and her dignity intact, because she knew her worth, and she would not allow anyone, not even herself, to convince her otherwise. Inside the house, her aunt was waiting, full of questions about the evening and eager for every detail. Vivienne answered as best she could, describing the splendor of the ballroom, the beauty of the assembled company, and yes, the confrontation with Serafina and the Duke's unexpected intervention. But she did not speak of the way her heart had raced when the Duke took her hand, or the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she could not predict or control. Some things were too fragile, too new, too frightening to be put into words. Some things needed to be held close and examined in private, like precious jewels whose value might diminish if exposed too quickly to the harsh light of day. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small room that served as her sanctuary, Vivienne allowed herself to remember every moment of her dance with the Duke. She remembered the strength of his hand at her waist, the intelligence in his eyes, the respect in his voice when he spoke to her. She remembered the way he had defended her, not out of pity, but out of genuine admiration for her courage. And she remembered his words, "You have grace. You have dignity. You have the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving hardship without allowing it to embitter you." No one had spoken to her like that in years. No one had seen her, truly seen her, as anything more than a burden or a charity case. The Duke had looked at her and seen worth, had recognized in her the qualities she had fought so hard to maintain through all the years of struggle and loss. It was dangerous to hope. She knew that. Hope was a luxury she could not afford, a risk she should not take. But as sleep finally claimed her, Vivienne found herself hoping nonetheless, dreaming of possibilities she dared not name but could not entirely dismiss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new reasons to doubt and retreat. But tonight, she had stood in the most exclusive ballroom in London and held her own against those who sought to diminish her. Tonight, she had danced with a Duke and been called worthy. Tonight, just for tonight, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. The morning after the Marchioness of Ashford's ball dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of London weather that seemed to seep into bones and dampen spirits. Vivienne woke to find her aunt already dressed and waiting in the small breakfast room, a collection of calling cards spread across the table like a hand of playing cards. 23, Lady Margaret announced without preamble, her eyes bright with an excitement Vivienne had never seen before. 23 calling cards, Vivienne. Do you understand what this means? Ladies who would not have acknowledged you on the street yesterday are now requesting the pleasure of your acquaintance, and gentlemen—" She paused dramatically, holding up a card embossed with a ducal crest. "The Duke of Ravensworth himself has sent word that he wishes to call upon you this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Vivienne's heart performed an uncomfortable acrobatic feat in her chest. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to imagine that the Duke's attention would extend beyond a single dance and a few kind words. Yet here was proof that he had not forgotten her, that whatever had passed between them in that crowded ballroom had been real enough to warrant a formal visit. "I have nothing suitable to wear for receiving a Duke," Vivienne said, her practical nature asserting itself even as her pulse raced. "My day dresses are already being attended to," her aunt interrupted. "I took the liberty of having your grey silk pressed and trimmed with fresh lace. It is modest but elegant, and it will suit admirably. Now you must eat something, even if you have no appetite. A lady does not entertain guests on an empty stomach, and you must be at your best this afternoon." The hours until 3 o'clock crawled by with agonizing slowness. Vivienne tried to occupy herself with reading, with needlework, with a dozen small tasks designed to keep her mind from dwelling on what the Duke's visit might mean. But her thoughts refused to be disciplined, spinning instead through a maze of possibilities and fears. Why was he calling on her? What could he possibly want with a woman of no fortune and questionable prospects? Was this merely an extension of his gallantry, or did it signal something more? By the time the clock struck 3, Vivienne had convinced herself that the Duke would not come, that he had thought better of his impulse and would send a polite note of apology instead. But at precisely 3 minutes past the hour, their modest butler announced, "His Grace the Duke of Ravensworth," and there he stood in their small drawing-room, his tall frame and aristocratic bearing making the space seem suddenly cramped and shabby. "Miss Langford," he said, bowing with a grace that would have seemed excessive from anyone else, but appeared perfectly natural from him. "Lady Fairfax, thank you for receiving me." "The honour is ours, Your Grace," Lady Margaret replied, executing a curtsy that would have done credit to a presentation at court. "Please do sit. May I offer you tea?" "Thank you. That would be most welcome." The ritual of tea service provided a blessed interval during which no one was required to make conversation. Vivienne poured with hands that trembled only slightly, conscious of the Duke's eyes upon her, of the way he seemed to fill the room not with arrogance, but with a quiet authority that came from generations of breeding and power. When the cups were distributed and Lady Margaret had settled back in her chair, the Duke turned his full attention to Vivienne. "I hope you suffered no ill effects from last evening's unpleasantness," he said. "Miss Aldwych has a talent for causing distress, and I would not wish you to be troubled by her malice." "I am quite well, Your Grace," Vivienne replied, grateful that her voice emerged steady and calm. "Though I confess I am surprised to see you here. Surely a man of your position has more pressing obligations than paying calls on relative strangers." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I make time for what interests me, Miss Langford, and I find you very interesting indeed. Your conduct last evening was exemplary, and I wish to assure myself that you had not been discouraged from continuing in society. It would be a loss if one evening's unpleasantness were to drive you away." "I am not so easily discouraged, Your Grace." "No," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "I did not think you were. Tell me, Miss Langford, what are your plans for the remainder of the season?" It was a simple question, but Vivienne heard the complexity beneath it. He was asking not just about her social calendar, but about her intentions, her goals, her understanding of her own place in the world they inhabited. She chose her words carefully. "I have no fixed plans, Your Grace. My aunt has been kind enough to include me in her household, and I attend such events as she deems appropriate. Beyond that, I am looking toward the future, toward securing a position that will allow me to support myself independently." "You are still determined to become a governess, then?" "I am determined to be useful, Your Grace, to earn my own living and owe my security to my own efforts rather than the charity of others." "An admirable goal," the Duke acknowledged, "but perhaps unnecessarily limiting. There are other paths open to a woman of your accomplishments and character." Before Vivienne could respond, Lady Margaret interjected with the kind of tactlessness only a maiden aunt could manage. "His Grace is quite right, Vivienne. A young woman of good family need not resort to employment if she makes a suitable marriage, and after last evening I am certain there will be gentlemen interested in making your acquaintance." The Duke's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Vivienne thought she detected a flicker of something. Amusement, perhaps, or irritation in his eyes. "Indeed," he said smoothly, "though I would caution that not all gentlemen who express interest will have Miss Langford's best interests at heart. The London marriage market can be a treacherous place for the unwary." "Are you speaking from experience, Your Grace?" Vivienne asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Extensive experience," he replied, that half-smile returning. "I have been the object of matrimonial pursuit since I came of age, Miss Langford. I have learned to recognize the difference between genuine regard and calculated ambition. It is a distinction that serves me well." There was a message in his words, though Vivienne could not quite decipher it. Was he warning her away, suggesting that any interest he showed would be misinterpreted as courtship, or was he indicating that his own interest was of the genuine variety? She had no frame of reference for such conversations, no experience in the subtle dance of aristocratic courtship. The visit lasted the prescribed 20 minutes, during which the Duke spoke of neutral topics, the weather, the upcoming theatre season, a musicale he was hosting at his London residence the following week. As he rose to take his leave, he turned to Lady Margaret with a request that made Vivienne's heart stutter in her chest. "Lady Fairfax, I am hosting a small gathering next Tuesday evening, nothing elaborate, merely music and conversation among friends. I would be honoured if you and Miss Langford would attend as my guests." Lady Margaret's acceptance was immediate and effusive. The Duke bowed over Vivienne's hand, his lips not quite touching her glove, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of sandalwood and the unsettling awareness that Vivian's life was changing in ways she could neither predict nor control. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity that left Vivian breathless and bewildered. Calling cards continued to arrive, invitations multiplied, and suddenly she found herself included in the very society that had seemed so unreachable only days before. But with increased visibility came increased danger, and that danger wore the face of Serafina Aldwych. Vivian encountered her rival 3 days after the Duke's visit at a garden party hosted by Lady Pemberton. The weather had cleared, producing one of those perfect spring afternoons that made London almost bearable, and the guests wandered through manicured gardens while servants circulated with champagne and delicate pastries. Vivian was admiring a particularly fine rose bush when she sensed a presence behind her. "Enjoying yourself, Miss Langford?" Serafina's voice was honeyed poison. "How novel it must be for you to attend events where you are actually wanted rather than merely tolerated." Vivian turned slowly, determined not to let Serafina see how the woman's words affected her. "Good afternoon, Miss Aldwych. What a lovely day for a garden party." "Let us dispense with pleasantries," Serafina said, moving closer and lowering her voice so that only Vivian could hear. "You may have fooled the Duke with your performance at the Ashford ball, but I see through you. You are a fortune hunter, plain and simple, using false modesty and manufactured dignity to attract the attention of wealthy men. It is despicable." "I have no designs on the Duke or any other man," Vivian replied quietly. "I seek only to make my own way in the world, by accepting his invitations, by allowing him to call upon you, by making yourself the object of speculation and gossip." Serafina's laugh was bitter. "You play your game well. I will grant you that. The helpless maiden, too proud to accept charity but not too proud to accept the protection of the most powerful man in England. It is a clever strategy, but it will fail." "Why do you hate me so?" Vivian asked, genuinely curious. "I have done nothing to you. I have no fortune, no prospects, no threat to your position. Why do you persist in this vendetta?" For a moment, something almost human flickered in Serafina's eyes. "Because you represent everything I'm not," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You have nothing, yet you walk with your head high. You have no money, yet you wear your shabby dresses with more grace than I wear my diamonds. The Duke looks at you and sees worth, while he looks at me and sees only wealth. Do you know what that feels like, Miss Langford? To have everything money can buy and still be found wanting." The admission was so unexpected, so raw, that Vivian found herself momentarily speechless. In that instant, she glimpsed the woman behind the cruelty, the insecurity that drove Serafina's vicious attacks. But the moment passed quickly, and Serafina's face hardened once more into its familiar mask of disdain. "But do not mistake that confession for weakness or sympathy," Serafina continued. "I will not allow you to take what should be mine. The Duke will marry someone of his own class, someone with the fortune and connections appropriate to his position. And when he tires of your novelty, as he inevitably will, I shall be there to console him. Remember that, Miss Langford, when you are choosing gowns for his musicale. Remember that you are playing a game you cannot win." She swept away in a rustle of expensive silk, leaving Vivian standing among the roses with a troubled heart. The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit, not because of Serafina's threats, but because of the grain of truth in her words. What was she doing? Accepting the Duke's invitations, allowing herself to hope for something that could never be. Men like Albert Thornbridge did not marry women like Vivian Langford. It was not cruelty but simple fact, the way the world worked. Yet when Tuesday evening arrived and she stood in the Duke's music room, surrounded by wealth and elegance that made even the Ashford ball seem modest by comparison, Vivian could not bring herself to regret her presence there. The room was intimate compared to a ballroom, designed to hold perhaps 50 guests, and every detail spoke of impeccable taste and limitless resources. A small orchestra occupied one corner, a celebrated soprano stood ready to perform, and the guests represented the cream of London society. The Duke greeted her warmly, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "Miss Langford, I am delighted you could come. May I introduce you to some friends?" The introductions that followed were dizzying. Lords and ladies whose names Vivian had only read in newspapers now stood before her, treating her with a courtesy that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. The Duke remained at her side throughout, his presence both comforting and unsettling, a constant reminder of the gulf between them. When the music began, Vivian lost herself in the soaring beauty of the soprano's voice. The woman sang Italian arias with such passion and skill that tears pricked at Vivian's eyes, reminding her of evenings at Langford Manor when her mother had played the pianoforte and her father had read poetry by candlelight. Those memories were bittersweet, aching reminders of a life that could never be reclaimed. "You appreciate music," the Duke said softly, appearing at her elbow as the first performance concluded and guests moved toward the refreshment tables. "I saw it in your face. You were not merely listening politely. You were truly moved." "My mother was an accomplished musician," Vivian admitted. "She used to say that music was the language of the soul, that it could express what words never could. I have not heard singing of that quality since before she died." "Then I am doubly glad you came this evening." His voice was gentle, understanding. "Tell me, Miss Langford, do you play?" "The pianoforte, though not with any great skill. I am competent, nothing more. I wonder if you would honor us with a performance, nothing formal, just a small piece if you are willing." Panic fluttered in Vivian's chest. To perform before these people, to expose her modest abilities to the judgment of those accustomed to the finest musicians in Europe, it seemed like madness. But the Duke was looking at her with such genuine interest, such encouragement, that she found herself nodding before caution could intervene. The pianoforte stood in an alcove, a magnificent instrument that probably cost more than her father's entire estate had been worth. Vivian settled onto the bench, her hands trembling slightly as they touched the keys. She chose a piece her mother had loved, a Mozart sonata that was technically challenging but within her capabilities if she did not let nervousness overcome her. The first notes rang out clear and true, and gradually Vivian forgot her audience, forgot her fears, forgot everything except the music flowing through her fingers. She was not a virtuoso, would never be mistaken for one, but she played with feeling, with the kind of emotional honesty that technical perfection could never match. And when the final chord faded into silence, the applause that followed was warm and seemingly sincere. "That was lovely, Miss Langford," an elderly countess said, approaching with a kind smile. "You play with real sensitivity. My granddaughter is in need of a music teacher. Would you consider taking her on as a student? I would pay generously, of course." The offer was unexpected, a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. This was exactly what Vivian had hoped to achieve, a respectable position that would allow her independence. She should accept immediately, gratefully. Yet something made her hesitate, made her glance toward the Duke, who stood watching with an expression she could not quite read. "That is very generous of you, Lady Thornton," Vivian said carefully. "Might I have a day or two to consider? I would not wish to commit without ensuring I could give your granddaughter the attention she deserves." "Of course, my dear. Send word to me at your convenience." As the evening progressed, Vivian received 2 more such offers, one to serve as companion to a widow traveling to Italy, another to teach music and French to the daughters of a wealthy merchant family. Each offer represented security, independence, the future she had claimed to want. Yet with each one, Vivian felt a strange reluctance, a pulling back from the very goal she had pursued. The Duke found her standing alone on a balcony, escaping the warmth and noise of the crowded music room. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of the garden below, and above them stars struggled to penetrate London's perpetual haze. "You were a great success this evening," he said, joining her at the railing. 3 offers of employment, countless compliments on your playing, and I believe Lord Ashworth's son was quite smitten. You should be pleased." "I am grateful," Vivian replied, which was not quite the same thing. "But not pleased." She turned to look at him, this man who had become the center of her confused and conflicting emotions. "Your Grace, I must ask you something, and I beg you to answer honestly. Why are you doing this? Why have you singled me out for your attention? I am nobody, nothing, and yet you have shown me more kindness and consideration than I have any right to expect. I do not understand your motivations, and it troubles me." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but intense. "Do you know what it is like, Miss Langford, to be surrounded by people who want something from you? Every conversation calculated, every smile designed to please, every word chosen to manipulate. I have lived my entire life in that environment, never knowing if I was valued for myself or merely for what I represent." He paused, his hands gripping the balcony railing. "And then I saw you in the Ashford ballroom, standing alone but undefeated, facing down cruelty with dignity and courage. You were not trying to impress anyone, were not angling for advantage. You simply knew your worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. Do you have any idea how rare that is, how refreshing?" "So I am a novelty to you," Vivian said, her heart sinking, an interesting diversion from the usual tedium of society. "No." The word was sharp, almost angry. "You are not a novelty. You are—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You are the first woman I have met in years who makes me want to be honest, to drop the pretenses and simply be myself. When I am with you, I do not feel like the Duke of Ravensworth, burdened by title and responsibility. I feel like Albert Thornbridge, a man who finds himself drawn to a woman of remarkable character and beauty." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. "Your Grace, you should not say such things to me. You know as well as I do that there can be nothing between us. You will marry someone of your own class, someone with fortune and connections, and I will secure employment and live out my days in respectable obscurity. That is the way of the world. What if I do not accept the way of the world? What if I believe that a man should marry where his heart leads, rather than where society dictates?" "Then you are a romantic and a fool," Vivian said, but her voice shook. "The world does not reward such foolishness, Your Grace. It crushes it. Your family would never accept me, society would never forgive you, and eventually you would come to resent the sacrifices you made. I will not be responsible for that. You assume much about what I am willing to sacrifice, and you assume much about what I am willing to accept." Vivian's composure finally cracked, her voice rising. "Do you think I could live with myself, knowing I had trapped you into a marriage that would damage your standing and disappoint your family? Do you imagine I want to be whispered about as the scheming nobody who entrapped a duke? I have my pride, Your Grace, and I will not surrender it, not even for—" She stopped, unable to complete the thought. "Not even for what?" he pressed, moving closer. "Say it, Vivian. Not even for what?" The use of her Christian name sent a shock through her system. "Please," she whispered, "please do not make this harder than it already is." "I am making it exactly as hard as it needs to be," he replied, "because I will not let you hide behind false practicality and misguided nobility. You feel something for me, just as I feel something for you. Deny it if you can." She could not. Standing there in the moonlight with the sounds of music drifting from the house behind them and the Duke's dark eyes searching her face, Vivienne could not summon the lie that would protect them both. "What I feel is irrelevant," she said instead. "It changes nothing." "It changes everything," he countered. "But I can see you need time, need to come to terms with possibilities you have not allowed yourself to consider. Very well. I will not press you further tonight, but know this, Vivian Langford. I am not a man who gives up easily, especially not when I have found something worth fighting for." He left her there on the balcony, returning to his guests and his duties as host, and Vivian remained in the darkness, her mind churning with confusion and her heart aching with a longing she dared not acknowledge. The following days brought no clarity, only increased turmoil. The Duke continued to call, continued to include her in his social circle, and the gossip mills of London began to churn with speculation about his intentions. Vivian found herself the subject of whispered conversations and knowing looks, and while some seemed genuinely pleased by the Duke's attentions, others, led by Seraphina Aldwych, made their disapproval abundantly clear. The crisis came 2 weeks after the musicale, at a ball hosted by the Duke's own sister, Lady Catherine Blackwood. It was the most exclusive event Vivian had yet attended, and she had agonized over her appearance, knowing she would be scrutinized more carefully than ever. She wore her best gown, altered yet again with new trim and ribbons, and her mother's pearls, and she told herself she was ready for whatever the evening might bring. She was wrong. The evening began pleasantly enough, with the Duke claiming her for the first waltz and making a point of introducing her to his sister, a formidable woman whose sharp eyes seemed to see everything and miss nothing. Lady Catherine was polite but reserved, her assessment of Vivienne as thorough as any military inspection. When she finally smiled, it seemed genuine but cautious, the approval of someone who had not yet made up her mind, but was willing to remain open to possibility. It was during the supper interval that disaster struck. Vivienne had stepped away from the main company to visit the ladies' retiring room, and when she emerged, she found Serafina waiting in the corridor, her beautiful face twisted with an emotion that went beyond mere malice into something approaching desperation. "He is going to offer for you," Serafina said without preamble. "I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he arranges his entire life to include you. He is going to make the greatest mistake of his life, and it is my duty to prevent it. Miss Aldwych, I have no control over the Duke's actions." "Liar!" The word was a hiss. "You have enchanted him somehow, made him believe you are something you are not. But I know the truth about you, Vivienne Langford, and I will make certain everyone else knows it too." Before Vivienne could respond, Serafina raised her voice, ensuring it would carry to the nearby ballroom. "You think you are so clever, so virtuous, but you are nothing but a fraud. Your father did not just die in debt. He died disgraced, caught in a scandal involving forged documents and fraudulent investments. The Langford name is not respected, it is tainted, and you are nothing but the daughter of a criminal." The accusation hung in the air like poisonous smoke. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face, felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The words were not entirely false. Her father had been involved in investments that failed spectacularly, and there had been whispers of impropriety, though nothing was ever proven. But to have it shouted in a public corridor, to hear her father's memory attacked and her own character impugned, was more than she could bear. "That is a lie," she managed to say, but her voice lacked conviction, weakened by shock and pain. "Is it?" Serafina's smile was triumphant. "Then perhaps you should ask yourself why your relatives barely acknowledge you, why you were forced to live on charity. Your father was a disgrace, Miss Langford, and you are his equally disgraceful daughter. The Duke deserves better than a woman with scandal in her blood and poverty in her pocket." People were gathering now, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mix of shock and avid curiosity. Vivienne saw Lady Catherine pushing through the crowd, saw the Duke following close behind, his expression thunderous. But she could not stay, could not stand there and watch as everything she had built over the past weeks crumbled to dust around her. She ran, through the crowd, down the grand staircase, out into the cool night air. Behind her, she heard voices calling her name, but she did not stop, could not stop, driven by a panic and shame that overwhelmed all rational thought. She had no plan, no destination, knew only that she had to escape, had to get away from the pitying looks and satisfied smirks, from the Duke's inevitable disappointment when he realized what she truly was. A hand caught her arm as she reached the street, spinning her around. The Duke stood before her, breathing hard from his pursuit, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from running. "Do not run from me," he said, his voice urgent. Whatever she said, whatever lies she told, they were not all lies, Vivienne interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "My father was involved in failed investments. There were questions about his business practices, rumors of impropriety. Nothing was ever proven, but the whispers followed us until his death. Serafina was right. I come from scandal, from disgrace. I am not worthy of your attention, Your Grace. I never was." "That is for me to decide," the Duke said fiercely. "Your father's troubles do not define you, Vivienne. Your character defines you, and I have seen more character in you than in all the supposedly respectable members of society combined. But your family, your position, how can you even consider associating with someone like me now that you know the truth?" He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "I can consider it because I love you," he said simply. "I love your courage, your dignity, your refusal to be diminished by circumstances. I love the way you play Mozart and the way you stand up to bullies. I love every stubborn, proud, beautiful part of you, and I will not let Serafina Aldwych or anyone else take you from me." Vivienne's world seemed to stop spinning. "You love me?" "Desperately. Completely. Since the moment I saw you in that ballroom, refusing to bow to cruelty." He pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. "Marry me, Vivienne. Become my Duchess. Not because I feel sorry for you or because I am making some grand romantic gesture, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "This is madness," she whispered, even as her heart sang with joy. "Then let us be mad together," he replied and kissed her. The kiss was everything Vivienne had not allowed herself to imagine. Tender yet passionate, gentle yet demanding, a promise and a claim all at once. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, she found herself laughing through her tears, a sound of pure joy that seemed to surprise them both. "I have not answered you yet," she said, her hands clutching the lapels of his coat as though afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Then answer me now," the Duke replied, his dark eyes searching hers. "Will you marry me, Vivienne Langford? Will you brave the storms that will undoubtedly come and stand beside me as my wife, my partner, my Duchess?" "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of certainty, of decision, of a future she had never dared to dream. "Yes, Albert, I will marry you." His smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious face into something almost boyish. He kissed her again, longer this time, and Vivienne lost herself in the sensation, in the impossible reality that this man, this powerful, respected, impossibly eligible man, wanted her, loved her, had chosen her above all others. A discreet cough from behind them broke the spell. They turned to find Lady Catherine standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Vivienne felt panic rise in her throat, certain that the Duke's sister had come to voice her objections, to remind them of all the reasons why such a marriage was impossible. "If you two are quite finished making a spectacle of yourselves in the street," Lady Catherine said dryly, "I would suggest you return inside and make a proper announcement. The gossips are having a field day with Miss Aldwich's theatrics, and I believe it is time to set the record straight." Albert's hand tightened around Vivienne's. "Catherine, if you are about to apologize for falling in love with a woman of sense and character rather than wealth and connections, I shall be very disappointed in you, brother." Lady Catherine's severe expression softened slightly. "Miss Langford, I will not pretend I was not concerned when I first observed Albert's interest in you. A duke must marry carefully, and our family has certain expectations. But I have watched you these past weeks, seen how you conduct yourself with grace under difficult circumstances, and I have concluded that you may be exactly what this family needs, someone who understands that dignity is not purchased, but earned." Vivienne found her voice with difficulty. "Lady Catherine, I am deeply grateful for your words, but surely you must have concerns about the scandal Miss Aldwych has just revealed. My father's reputation was that of a man who took risks and suffered for them," Lady Catherine interrupted firmly. "There is no shame in failure, Miss Langford, only in dishonesty and cowardice. From what I have been able to ascertain in the brief time since Miss Aldwich's outburst, your father was guilty of neither. He made poor investments, yes, but he broke no laws and told no lies. The rest is merely gossip, and gossip has no power over those who refuse to grant it importance." She extended her hand to Vivienne. "Now come, let us return inside and show society that the future Duchess of Ravensworth is not intimidated by the spite of jealous rivals." The walk back into the ballroom was one of the longest of Vivienne's life. She was acutely conscious of her tear-stained face, her disheveled appearance, the whispers that followed them like a physical presence. But Albert's hand remained steady in hers, and Lady Catherine walked on her other side like a formidable guardian, and somehow that gave her the courage to lift her head and face the assembled company. The crowd parted before them as they made their way to the center of the ballroom. The orchestra had stopped playing, and an unnatural silence had fallen over the gathering. Vivienne could see Serafina near the refreshment tables, her face a mask of vindictive satisfaction that faltered when she saw them returning together. Albert raised his hand, commanding attention with nothing more than his presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attendance this evening at my sister's ball. It has been an eventful night, and I find it has brought clarity to matters I have been contemplating for some time. It is therefore my great pleasure to announce my engagement to Miss Vivian Langford, who has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, slowly at first and then with gathering enthusiasm, until the entire ballroom rang with applause and congratulations. Not everyone was pleased, of course. Vivian could see the disapproval on certain faces, could read the calculation in others as they reassessed her value now that she bore the Duke's protection. And Serafina looked as though she might shatter like fine porcelain, her face white with rage and something that might have been grief. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Vivian felt something unexpected, pity. Serafina had everything money could buy, yet she had lost the one thing that mattered, had driven away through her own cruelty the possibility of genuine connection. There was no triumph in that realization, only a sad acknowledgement of the different paths their lives had taken. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of well-wishes and barely disguised curiosity. Vivian answered questions with as much grace as she could muster, accepted congratulations from people who had ignored her weeks earlier, and tried to wrap her mind around the fact that her entire life had changed in the span of a single evening. She was going to be a Duchess. She was going to marry Albert Thornbridge. It seemed impossible, like a fairy tale told to children, yet it was real, undeniable, already set in motion. As the ball finally drew to a close and Albert escorted her to her aunt's carriage, Vivian allowed herself to lean against him, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the night. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we plan a wedding," Albert replied, his arm tightening around her. "And we prepare for the challenges that will undoubtedly come. Not everyone will accept our marriage easily, Vivian. There will be those who question your suitability, who spread rumors and make difficulties. Are you prepared for that?" "I survived Serafina Aldwych," Vivian said with a tired smile. "I believe I can survive whatever else society throws at me, especially with you beside me." "Always beside you," he promised. "From this moment forward, whatever storms may come, we face them together." The weeks that followed tested that promise in ways neither of them had anticipated. The announcement of their engagement had sent shockwaves through London society, and the reactions ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed hostility. Albert's family, while ultimately supportive, had concerns about the match that needed to be addressed. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, travelled from the country estate to meet Vivian, and that interview was one of the most intimidating experiences of Vivian's life. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman in her 60s, elegant and commanding, with the same dark eyes as her son but wielded with considerably more intimidation. She received Vivian in her London townhouse, a grand establishment that spoke of generations of wealth and privilege, and for 20 minutes subjected her to what could only be described as an interrogation. "My son tells me you play the pianoforte," the Dowager said, her voice cool and assessing. "Play for me." Vivian sat at the magnificent instrument in the music room, her hands trembling slightly as she began one of the Mozart pieces she knew best. She was aware of the Dowager's eyes upon her, judging not just her musical skill, but everything about her, her posture, her expression, her ability to perform under pressure. When the piece concluded, the silence stretched uncomfortably before the Dowager spoke again. "You play with feeling, though your technique could use refinement. A duchess must be accomplished in all the arts. I will arrange for you to study with Signor Benedetti. He is the finest teacher in London and will not tolerate anything less than excellence." "Thank you, Your Grace," Vivian said, uncertain whether she had passed or failed some test. "Do not thank me yet," the Dowager replied. "Being a duchess is not merely about playing pretty music and wearing fine gowns. It is about managing estates, overseeing staff, hosting events that carry political and social significance, representing the family with dignity and grace under all circumstances. It requires intelligence, discipline, and an understanding of duty that supersedes personal comfort or desire. Do you believe yourself capable of such responsibilities? Vivienne met the older woman's gaze directly. I do not know if I am capable, Your Grace. I have not been trained for such a role, and I will undoubtedly make mistakes. But I am willing to learn, and I am not afraid of hard work or responsibility. I love your son, and I will do everything in my power to be worthy of the position he has asked me to fill. The dowager's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That is the correct answer. Confidence without humility is arrogance, but humility without determination is weakness. You will need both in the years to come. She paused, then added more gently, My son has chosen well, I think. You have character, Miss Langford, and character is the foundation upon which everything else must be built. The rest can be taught. It was as close to approval as Vivienne could have hoped for, and when she relayed the conversation to Albert later that day, his relief was palpable. Mother's blessing matters a great deal, he admitted, not because I would change my mind without it, but because her support will make everything else easier. She carries enormous influence in society, and if she accepts you, others will follow. And what of your other relatives? Vivienne asked. I understand you have uncles, cousins, numerous family connections who may not be as accepting. Some will object, Albert acknowledged. My Uncle Richard, in particular, has very traditional views about appropriate marriages for ducal heirs. But ultimately the decision is mine, and I have made it. They will adapt or they will not, but either way it changes nothing between us. The wedding was planned for 8 weeks hence, a relatively short engagement by aristocratic standards, but one that both Albert and Vivienne preferred. Every day brought new challenges, dress fittings, lessons in protocol and precedence, meetings with solicitors to arrange settlements, consultations about the ceremony itself. Vivienne moved through it all in a kind of daze, supported by Albert's steady presence and the surprisingly warm friendship that developed between her and Lady Catherine. You must understand, Catherine told her one afternoon as they reviewed guest lists for the wedding breakfast, that marrying Albert means accepting a life of public scrutiny. Everything you do will be observed and judged. You will never again have the luxury of privacy or anonymity. Some women find that burden unbearable. And what of you? Vivienne asked. You married Lord Blackwood, who is not without his own prominence. How did you manage? By remembering that other people's opinions have only the power I choose to give them, Catherine replied. I know who I am, what I value, what I am willing to compromise, and what I will defend to my last breath. That clarity allows me to navigate society without being destroyed by it. You will need to find the same clarity, Vivienne. It was good advice, and Vivienne tried to hold on to it as the wedding date approached and the pressure intensified. Not all the attention was negative. Many people seemed genuinely pleased by the match, charmed by the romantic narrative of a duke choosing love over fortune. But there were still those who whispered about her unsuitability, who spread rumors about her father's supposed scandals, who predicted that the marriage would end in disaster. The most painful opposition came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks before the wedding, Vivienne received a visit from her cousin, George Langford, a distant relation who had inherited what little remained of the family property. He was a pompous man in his 40s, and Vivienne had met him only a handful of times, always with mutual discomfort. I felt it my duty to call upon you, George said, settling himself in the drawing room with an air of self-importance. Family must look after family, after all, and I would be remiss if I did not offer my guidance in this delicate situation. Guidance? Vivienne asked warily. Regarding your impending marriage to the Duke. Vivienne, I say this with your best interests at heart. You are making a grave mistake. You are not prepared for the life of a duchess, not equipped to handle the responsibilities and expectations. You will embarrass yourself, embarrass the Duke, and by extension embarrass the entire Langford family. Vivienne felt anger rise in her chest. The Langford family has shown precious little interest in my welfare until now, George. Where was this familial concern when I was passed from relative to relative like an unwanted parcel? Where was this guidance when I had nothing? That is precisely my point, George continued, oblivious to her anger. You have nothing. No fortune, no training in managing great estates, no understanding of the political and social complexities of ducal life. The kind thing, the honourable thing, would be to release the Duke from his engagement before you both suffer the consequences of this ill-advised match. The honourable thing, Vivian said, her voice dangerously quiet, would be for you to leave my home and never presume to speak to me of honour again. I will not release the Duke from our engagement because I love him and he loves me, and we are both quite capable of determining what is best for our own lives without your interference. You are being foolish and stubborn, George blustered. When this marriage fails, when you find yourself drowning in responsibilities you cannot manage, do not come crying to the family for support. I would sooner drown than seek support from a family that never supported me when I truly needed it, Vivian replied. Good day, George. Show yourself out. After he left, Vivian allowed herself to shake with anger and hurt. The encounter had opened old wounds, reminded her of all the years she had spent feeling unwanted and burdensome, but it had also clarified something important. She was not that helpless girl anymore. She had survived loss and poverty, had faced down Serafina Aldwych and the judgment of society, had won the love of an extraordinary man. She was not defined by George's limitations or the family's abandonment. She was defining herself, creating her own future, and no one would take that from her. When Albert arrived later that afternoon, he found her in the garden, sitting among the roses with a determined expression. My cousin George paid me a visit, she told him without preamble. He believes I should release you from our engagement for your own good. Albert sat beside her, taking her hand. And what did you tell him? I told him to leave and never return. She turned to look at him, suddenly vulnerable. Albert, what if he is right? Not about releasing you, but about my ability to be the Duchess you need. I have no training, no experience in managing the kind of life you lead. What if I fail you? Then you fail, and you learn, and you try again, Albert said simply. Vivian, I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be yourself, the brave, honest, resilient woman I fell in love with. That woman is more than capable of learning whatever she needs to know. And she will not be alone. I will be with you every step of the way, and so will Catherine and my mother, and everyone else who matters. You are joining a family, not facing an ordeal. A family, Vivian repeated softly. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. Then let me remind you, Albert said and kissed her gently. Family means belonging. It means support and love and knowing you are not alone. It means having people who believe in you even when you doubt yourself. That is what I am offering you, Vivian. Not just a title or a position, but a true family. The words broke something open inside her, and Vivian found herself crying for the second time in Albert's presence, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than pain. She had spent so many years believing she would always be alone, would always be the unwanted relation living on sufferance. To be offered something different, something real and lasting, it was almost too much to comprehend. The final weeks before the wedding passed with increasing rapidity. Vivian threw herself into her preparations, studying everything she could about estate management and social protocol, working with the Dowager's recommended tutors to refine her accomplishments, learning the names and histories of the countless relatives and connections she would be expected to know as Duchess. It was exhausting and often overwhelming, but she refused to be defeated by the challenge. She also made an unexpected peace with Serafina Aldwych. The encounter happened by chance, at a modiste's shop where both had appointments for fittings. They found themselves alone in a private salon, separated from the seamstresses by a heavy curtain, and for a long moment simply stared at each other. I suppose I should offer congratulations, Serafina said finally, her voice lacking its usual venom. You have won, after all. The prize is yours. He was never a prize, Vivian replied quietly. He is a man, a complicated, intelligent, remarkable man who deserves to be loved for himself rather than his title. Yes, well, easy for you to say now that you have secured that title. But there was no real bite to the words, only a weary resignation. Do you know what the worst part is, Miss Langford? I look at you and I see everything I pretended not to want. Genuine affection, respect, a partnership based on something other than financial calculation. My parents arranged my debut, my wardrobe, my entire life with the goal of securing an advantageous marriage, but no one arranged for me to be someone worth loving. The admission was startling in its honesty. Vivian found herself responding with equal candor. It is not too late to become that person, Miss Aldwick. You are young, beautiful, wealthy. If you chose to use those advantages differently, to develop character alongside your accomplishments, you might find the happiness that has eluded you. Serafina laughed bitterly. Advice from the victor to the vanquished. How generous. Not advice, Vivian corrected. Just an observation from someone who understands that circumstances shape us but need not define us. I was shaped by loss and poverty, but I chose not to let those things make me bitter or cruel. You have been shaped by wealth and expectation, but you could choose to let them make you compassionate, rather than calculating. Perhaps, Serafina said, though she did not sound convinced. But some patterns are set too deeply to change. She moved toward the door, then paused. I will not trouble you again, Miss Langford, or should I say, Your Grace, wear your victory well. At least one of us should be happy. She left before Vivian could respond, and though their interaction had been civil, Vivian felt a profound sadness for the woman who might have been her friend in another life, under different circumstances. Serafina was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when one confused worth with wealth, when one measured success by external standards rather than internal contentment. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather, as though the universe itself had decided to smile upon their union. The ceremony was held at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, packed with nobility and decorated with thousands of white roses. Vivian wore a gown of white silk so exquisite it took her breath away, her mother's pearls at her throat, and a veil of antique lace that had belonged to the Duke's grandmother. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Lady Margaret's husband, who had agreed to give her away, Vivian felt a moment of pure, crystalline clarity. Every step of her difficult journey, her parents' deaths, the loss of her home, the years of living on charity, the humiliation at the Ashford ball, all of it had led her here to this moment, to this man who waited for her at the altar with such love in his eyes it made her heart ache. The ceremony itself passed in a dream. She heard herself speak the vows, felt Albert's hand steady and warm in hers, saw the joy on Lady Catherine's face and the approval in the dowager's eyes. And when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, when Albert lifted her veil and kissed her before all of London society, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. The wedding breakfast was a lavish affair at the Duke's London residence, filled with toasts and laughter and music. Vivian moved through it in a haze of happiness, accepting congratulations, speaking with relatives she had just met, trying to commit hundreds of names and faces to memory. But through it all, she remained anchored by Albert's presence, by the way his hand would find hers in the crowd, by the smiles they exchanged that spoke of private jokes and shared understanding. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared to leave for Ravensworth, the Duke's country estate where they would spend their honeymoon, Albert drew her aside into a quiet alcove. "Happy, Your Grace?" he asked, using her new title with obvious pleasure. "Deliriously," Vivian admitted, "though it still feels unreal. I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream." "If it is a dream, then we are both dreaming it," Albert replied, pulling her close. "And I, for one, never want to wake. You are everything I hoped for and more, Vivian. You were magnificent today, gracious, elegant, every inch a duchess. I had an excellent teacher in your mother, and a perfect example to follow in your sister." "You had your own strength and character," Albert corrected. "That is what made the difference. That is what will always make the difference." They travelled to Ravensworth that night, arriving at the great estate as dawn broke over the surrounding parkland. The house was enormous, far larger than Vivian's childhood home, but it welcomed her with warm light spilling from windows and staff lined up to greet their new Duchess. The housekeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Roberts, took Vivian under her wing immediately, showing her through the principal rooms and making it clear that she considered Vivian's comfort her personal mission. The first weeks at Ravensworth were a period of adjustment and discovery. Vivian learned the rhythms of the estate, met with the staff, explored the grounds, and began to understand the scope of her new responsibilities. Albert had not exaggerated when he spoke of the complexity of ducal life. There were tenant farmers to meet, estate business to understand, correspondence to manage, charitable obligations to fulfill. It was overwhelming at times, but Vivian approached it as she had approached every other challenge in her life, with determination and a willingness to learn. She also discovered the deep satisfaction of building a true partnership with her husband. They discussed estate matters together, made decisions jointly, supported each other through difficulties. Albert valued her opinions and sought her advice, treating her as an equal partner rather than a decorative wife. And in their private moments, away from the demands of duty and society, they discovered each other with a joy and passion that deepened their bond beyond anything Vivienne had imagined possible. 3 months after the wedding, Vivienne stood in the garden at Ravensworth watching the sun set over the estate that was now her home. She thought of the young woman who had walked into the Ashford ballroom all those months ago, frightened and uncertain, but determined to hold on to her dignity. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Albert approaching, his expression tender. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist. "About how far I have come," Vivian admitted, "about all the moments that led me here, about how grateful I am for every trial and hardship, because without them, I would not be the woman you fell in love with." "And I am grateful for those trials too," Albert said, "because they shaped you into the extraordinary woman standing before me. You are my Duchess, Vivian. But more than that, you are my partner, my love, my home. Everything else is just window dressing." Vivian turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had changed her life so completely. "I love you, Albert Thornbridge, not for your title or your wealth, but for your character, your kindness, your belief in me when I struggled to believe in myself." "And I love you, Vivian Thornbridge," he replied, "for your courage, your grace, your beautiful, indomitable spirit. You walked into that ballroom knowing you did not belong, and you proved that belonging has nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with character. You belong here with me because you are worthy, not because of what you have, but because of who you are." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together in the garden, two people from different worlds who had found each other against all odds. Their love had weathered judgment and scandal, had survived the obstacles society placed in their path, and had emerged stronger for the trials they faced together. Vivian Langford, once a nobody living on charity, had become the Duchess of Ravensworth, not through calculation or manipulation, but through simple honesty and unwavering dignity. She had known her worth even when others doubted it, had held fast to her principles even when it seemed easier to surrender them. And in doing so, she had won not just a title, but a true partnership built on love, respect, and mutual devotion. The story that had begun with humiliation in a crowded ballroom had ended with triumph, but more importantly, with happiness, the kind of deep, lasting happiness that comes from being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved for exactly who you are. And as they walked back to the house together, hand in hand, Vivienne knew that this was not really an ending at all, but the beginning of everything she had ever hoped for, and more than she had ever dared to dream. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Vivienne and Albert's beautiful journey from that fateful night at the Ashford Ball to their triumph of love and dignity. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Echoes of Romance so you never miss another tale of love, courage, and happily ever after. We would love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment below telling us your favorite moment from this story, and don't forget to hit that like button and activate notifications so you'll be the first to know when we share our next romantic adventure. Your support means the world to us, and we cannot wait to bring you more stories that celebrate the power of love and the strength of the human spirit. Until next time, may you always know your worth and never be afraid to claim the happiness you deserve.